Good morning. My name is Bradley Hampson. I am the Assistant Superintendent of Technology for Frontier School Division. Thank you for joining us, both out on the web and here locally. Presenting to us this morning is Dr. John Murray from the Department of Education, Manitoba, and he will be presenting on engaging the national community in the future of science education. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you, and in particular, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our colleagues at Cranberry Portage. So welcome. Today is an important day, I would like to think, on a number of fronts. Certainly personally, in terms of a journey that I've recently completed at the University of Manitoba in a doctoral program, and perhaps more generally for the science education community at large in Canada. Today represents the first public announcement of the results of a national study which formed the core of my dissertation work over the past couple of years. And when I think in terms of how a study like this might relate to engagement, it's rather inescapable for me to think in terms of passion and an emotional commitment to something that has real value. For me, that's probably perhaps at the core of engagement in any process, and particularly something that might actually fire one's imagination. So I appreciate the opportunity this morning to be able to share the results of this national study with my colleagues here this morning and with all of you at points further in the north. One of the questions that often came to my mind in recent years, and I've been involved in science education for more than 25 years as an individual, is why do we have science education at all in a formal educational setting? And we are living in times where there is great fluidity to the answer to that question. We sometimes look upon this as maybe potentially two great end members in terms of disengagement on the one hand and perhaps a hyper engagement that's very superficial at the other end. I might be looking for something that might be somewhere in between those two. About 5 or 6 years ago, a remarkable piece of research came out of Stockholm from the Center of Resilience and Stewardship in Sweden. And it's come to be known as the Planetary Boundaries Research. And that research is demonstrating that there are 9 large-scale boundaries within which humanity operates very, very closely embedded with planetary systems. And of those 9 boundaries, 3 of those have already been exceeded in a tremendous fashion. That being the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, the loss of biodiversity in our ecosystems, and the warming of our world through the engagement in activities, particularly very carbon-intensive activities by humanity. Just 5 short years after this initial publication in 2009, we've now exceeded a fourth of these 9 planetary boundaries, which originally was not quantified, and it's the planetary boundary related to pollution and those elements that we put into the biosphere. In this particular graphic here, the comfortable habitats for humanity is contained within the boundaries outlined in green. And by virtue of exceeding those boundaries, we recognize that there's a great deal of stress that humanity is putting on the planet. As we may find out from the results of this study, an understanding of planetary boundaries may become one of the chief reasons for pursuing science education going forward. As a preliminary to the research that was accomplished in this study, when we look back over the last 50 or 60 years of science education, in my estimation, there are 3 significant periods of change, particularly within formal education. And this dates all the way back to that critical period in the early to mid-1950s, where there was a growing interest in the training of future scientists and engineers, principally from the standpoint of an urgency related to the national interest. Some would call this the post-Sputnik phenomenon. There are many other sociological and socioeconomic reasons for why there was a major thrust then. The second 2 trajectories that are identified here also indicate periods of great social change. So that the advent of science, technology, and its relationships to society and the environment, which was born out of the late 60s and the Cultural Revolution there into the 70s, it was manifest in some significant change in science curriculum. We are now living, perhaps now, in the tail end of a third trajectory period, which is clearly related to increased economic globalization, the recognition that outcomes and standards-based curricula are the manner in which frameworks are generally developed, and neoliberal economic viewpoints. So I felt as though this represents a remarkable opportunity to maybe go back to those first principles and identify where we may be going in science education for the next 25 to 30 years. In 2011, I had the good fortune of being in Greece. And the Temple of Apollo at Delphi in Greece was a place where individuals, generally from the nobility or from the military or from governance, would seek forecasting advice from a woman who was the priestess at the temple, and she was identified as being the Pythia. Geologically speaking, there are ethylene vapors that naturally emanate from this point in Greece. And ethylene is, at the very least, a mild intoxicant, and in the extreme is in fact a hallucinogen. So it's entirely possible that the oracle at Delphi actually has biogeochemical roots in something that may be factual. Whether or not I was imbued with these ethylene vapors is uncertain, but it gave me the kernel of the idea to hatch a methodology that's been well known now for about 50 years, and it's known as a Delphi study. So the framework and the foundation in terms of the methodology of this study took its lead from the oracle, which was an individual who would be forecasting potentially an unknown future. And so in my particular case, the Delphi was going to be involved with bringing together a national expert panel from a variety of positions, economically, academically, educationally, and so on, and convening over a 4 to 5 month period in a remarkable and vigorous and anonymous and online exchange. The purpose of conducting the study, as I have alluded to, is that the timing of this was, I think, particularly propitious. Looking for an opportunity to seek consensus through an anonymous exchange with an expert community on the whole notion of, is there a particularly Canadian approach to science education that heretofore we have not had the opportunity to pursue? Because in the previous 3 trajectories that I outlined, the large source that was driving most of science curriculum reform in this country was a preponderance of American influences. And that's not necessarily an indication that those influences were benevolent or indifferent or perhaps even aside from the Canadian experience. I felt as though there was perhaps a testable hypothesis here in terms of the generation of a particularly Canadian approach. And in terms of the significance of the study, for me it was threefold, related to where we are historically, the emergence of new trends, and also the Canadian context. Historically, we have now reached a point where we are about 60 years out from those 1950s and 1960s reforms related to science in the national interest. We are 30 years since the last time there was a pan-Canadian study related to science education done by the Science Council of Canada in the early 1980s. And we are now 20 years out from the Council of Ministers of Education Canada's national framework, which is the one which has provided Manitoba its curriculum frameworks in science education since 1999-2000. But there's a new emergence taking place right now in the United States with respect to this outcomes and standards movement. And that's the next generation science standards, which have now been adopted in about 12 or 13 US states, even though there were some 26 states that were involved in the initial construction of the standards. There has been some difficulty in these standards taking hold south of the border, but the influences of a document such as this, being rooted in very, very large institutional science in the United States, these have traditionally been the commonplace influences in our curriculum in Canada for decades. So that's an important consideration. Thirdly is the Canadian context. The enterprise of what it means to be a Canadian, in my estimation, is changing rapidly, and in particular, with our position geopolitically and geographically as a large circumpolar nation with a small population, tremendously large value in terms of ecosystem services, we're in a rather unique and very, very sensitive position going forward, particularly given the environmental sensitivities of being a large hinterland in a circumpolar environment. The research questions may be difficult for you to see given the nature of how they're presented here. So there will be something advantageous for you. If you are looking for the complete details of the study, I do have a manuscript available to you that occupies much, much more time than what we might have this morning. And I invite you to take that along with you. But the study was essentially threefold in terms of its research questions. First of all, looking at national and international trends that were the expectations of going forward with respect to science curriculum change in Canada. Secondly, the manner in which we might be able to develop a set of consensus positions or dissensus, if you will, disagreement, in terms of the interests that would come forward from the convening of an expert community. So this is really where the foundation of developing potentially new goals and foundations for science education was going to come. Thirdly, I mentioned the Canadian context just a moment ago. I was interested in determining whether through this particular study, whether there would be the emergence of a kind of Canadian vision for science education. Not rooted in some type of patriotism of sorts, but more about appealing to the distinguishing characteristics of Canada as a nation. So with those as the basis going forward, you may have an interest in where across the Canadian spectrum would the participants in this study have come from. And there were 130 individuals who were invited to participate in this study by name and by letter. As you can see from this particular graphic, there was quite a diversity of these individuals, but the larger numbers who were receiving these invitations were coming from teacher educators and faculties of education. It's difficult to see here. There's been a bit of a contextual difficulty working with two different versions of PowerPoint. But this is essentially the cohort from ministries of education across the country. And this cohort here, which was perhaps the second largest of this particular group, were all science teachers, all of whom had one unique characteristic. They were all past winners of a Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence with an orientation towards the sciences. And that was across K through 12. So the identification of the science teacher cohort had a particular set of criteria. The most significant criterion was the fact that they were acknowledged nationally in terms of their commitment to excellence. In terms of the jurisdictions that these individuals came from, there were certain specific reasons why two of the jurisdictions were oversampled. The most obvious one for us here is the fact that there were a preponderance of individuals in terms of the Western provinces who were invited from the Manitoba science education community. There were some manifest reasons within the study that did in fact happen. Alberta was oversampled by virtue of the level of interest that was generated in the study through those initial invitations. There was one jurisdiction, Quebec, which was not represented in terms of the population by virtue of the study being conducted in English. And that, of course, was something that was going to represent a significant barrier to larger numbers coming from Quebec. But for the most part, the Canadian mosaic was reasonably well represented within the cohort that was invited to the study. And though this group worked for about 4 to 5 months with me in an online environment, and they were all anonymous to one another, they were actually divided into 2 cohorts. This was an unknown to the participants, but it comes out in the main body of the results. So the groups of participants were separated across 2 cohorts of experience. Those having less than 20 years of direct experience within the scientific community, within faculties of education, for example, science teachers and so on. And then a second cohort, which was a more veteran cohort, having at least 20 or more years. And one of the identifications that these 2 cohorts made in the study was whether they had an inclination to what I'm going to refer to as a Vision 1 or a Vision 2 science education. And this goes back to the work of 30 years ago by Doug Roberts in Ontario, who identified a Vision 1 science orientation as a vision of science education primarily for professional purposes, or for professional preparation, or interpreting the world as a scientist would view the world. A Vision 2 orientation as an educator would be that more inclined towards active democratic citizenship in terms of a science education, and the use of science and its principles and its values for the purposes of understanding the world and its issues. So when we look at those 2 cohorts, there was one distinction that might be able to be made. The more veteran cohort had arguably more firmly rooted decisiveness in terms of their vision for science education as a professional. And so when you look at this middle ground in here, there's generally a much greater commitment towards a strong orientation to Vision 1 on the left, or a very strong orientation to Vision 2 on the right. The younger cohort actually showed a situation that was perhaps more fluid and perhaps more evolving, with as many as a quarter of the individuals in the younger cohort actually indicating that they see at least 2 or more purposes, and therefore they identified essentially no commitment either way. So we need to keep in mind that as I go through the findings of the study, that there are in fact 2 cohorts here, an early to mid-career versus a more veteran cohort. Now to the findings. I'm going to present a series of charts, and the details of which I'll cite just certain particular components of these. Please consider taking a manuscript if you want to see this in perhaps greater detail. And essentially the research questions evolved in the Delphi study as a series of questionnaires. And so in a Delphi, typically what you would do in the first round is that you would have, as I had 4 large-scale, rather general questions that were responded to at length through expository writing. And that generated in excess of 700 pages of submissions from these participants. They weren't all lengthy. Some of them were remarkably lengthy. And it reminds me of that passion and that emotional commitment. So of that first round, the detailed coding of those responses then generates a series of scaled, more questionnaire-oriented items that become rating scales for the participants. So what you're going to see from here on out is the results of all 3 rounds of the Delphi. The initial lengthy expository writing, the coding of which provided a series of scale items in a questionnaire, and there were over 50 items in the questionnaire. And then in between rounds there is feedback delivered back to the participants, so they actually see each other's responses, but they don't see them personally, of course. They see them collectively as an aggregate. And throughout this study, the entire group was essentially working as a committee, so to speak. They did not see identifiable subgroups of individuals within the study. But they do see the means of the responses. They do see some rather simple descriptive statistical analyses. And then the last round is generally where you're starting to look for consensus positions that are rather solid versus those that are much more fluid. In terms of the desired influences going forward on science education in Canada, across both cohorts, the issues that are related to science and education for sustainability was seen by this group of individuals as having, in their view, the most important and the most desirable influence on the future course of science education in Canada. There was great commonality across both these cohorts, and what you're going to see in most of these charts is maybe the top 5 rated items out of as many as 11 or 12 different items within that particular component of the results. And I highlighted for the sake of today the relevance of science education for students as being something that rose to right to the top, if you will, of the reasons that we might want to begin to look at what those desired influences will be going forward. And new learning technologies was something that was discussed at great detail along the way, as well as the opportunity for perhaps a whole reconceptualization of the purposes of science education. At the other side of that, there were some problematic influences that both cohorts identified. And what I find fascinating about this is the opportunities that these difficulties or these tensions might provide for opening up new avenues of research. The items near the top of these lists represent situations where there was great tension even within this group comprising the expert panel. Things that they really struggled with, things that they had vehement disagreement with, or actually had tremendously positive views on. And it was interesting to see that among the younger cohort, the influences of national and international assessments and the effects that those may have on science education going forward was seen as one of the most undesirable influences that they could imagine. And for us here in Canada, when we recognize that both cohorts recognize the integration of Indigenous perspectives in science education as an area of great concern and of great struggle. There was tremendous dissensus and polarity across this particular group with respect to the integration of Indigenous perspectives, something that we really need to pay some close attention to in terms of how this is going to manifest itself in the coming years. So those two things are, I think, worth of great importance to mention today. The influence of national and international standards of achievement and the potential influences of Indigenous perspectives in a country such as Canada. In terms of the foundations for science education, both cohorts identified for the second time science and education for sustainability as being at the very top in terms of the importance for laying the actual foundations of why we pursue the enterprise of science education, if you will. Most of what followed from this represents easily the last 20 or 30 years of foundations. These are all recognizable to Canadian science educators. So the one significant change that we may be seeing in the last 20 years is the emergence of sustainability and science and sustainability as perhaps being a whole new set of foundation areas for the enterprise. When they looked at the goals for science education, they were rather seeing goals as being those end desires, if you will, of a whole K-12 science education experience. So this brought forward a very, very different set of conditions as compared to the foundations. And there was virtual 95% or more consensus that literacy or literacies related to socio-scientific issues should be among the chief goals for a Canadian science education. And when we look at things such as being a contributor to human health and well-being, if we look at citizenship in a global technology-rich society, if we look at economic competitiveness as being something that was rather low on the agenda, this is an expert panel that actually, in many cases, is at odds with the views of organizations such as the Conference Board of Canada, which might put economic competitiveness of Canadians right at the very top of the agenda for education in the sciences. I like to look at things, and perhaps it's my relationship that I have that oftentimes is tensile by working within a Department of Education. I like to view most things as either potentially threatening or an opportunity. And those things that perhaps might be threatening oftentimes give us the opportunities. Among the questions that the group responded to is that they took a look at the whole notion of what might be the characteristics of a Canadian vision for science education. That came out of their writings and became a part of the rating scales. On the left, going from the bottom to the top, you have increasing levels of threat. And on the right-hand side, you actually have increasing levels of opportunity. And it was interesting to note that the short space of provincial electoral cycles and the control of curriculum by provincial ministries of education was seen as a constraint and not necessarily as an opportunity in science education. But at the same time, interprovincial cooperation in terms of matters curriculum and so on was actually seen as a great Canadian strength. So there was a great deal that was said about the importance of maintaining the health of a federal view and a cooperative view. And First Nations, Métis and Inuit voices and perspectives, despite the tensile characteristics that might bring to science education, was seen potentially as a real opportunity. So what might be some indicators of a Canadian approach to science education? Well, in answer to this one, we can see that there are two things that seem to have emerged as rather defining characteristics. And in the rating scales for items such as this, they were essentially looking at a scale. Does this really define who we are as Canadians, or is this something that is less defining? Well, science education for a sustainable future and the relationship of a science education as a participant in a democratic society and the relationship that might exist between Canada and its geography as a circumpolar nation and Indigenous ways of knowing, that's a very, very striking set of features that might actually argue for a less Americanized science education and perhaps a respectful look at what might be a more Canadian inclination. We had individuals in this study from many walks of life and from many particular interests. The answer to the question of who should be designing the science curriculum was a very important one for me as an individual, because I had the opportunity to participate in curriculum design both as a teacher, both as an individual with a Department of Education, and arguably as a professional geoscientist, which goes back a few years. When the Pan-Canadian Science Framework was developed in the 1980s, it was often described as a quintessentially bureaucratic process that involved principally a very, very small number of individuals from ministries of education across the country, with some degree of input and advice from teacher cohorts, with some advice coming from the literature. But there was one group that was significantly and notably absent, and perhaps two groups, but one certainly that was noticeably absent from that process of about 20 years ago, and that was science teacher educators. They were not involved in any fashion in the development of a national framework for science education. This group seems to want to change that. This chart has 3 columns, essentially groups who are the decision makers, those who have advisory roles, and those who, at least within this study, there was no firmly definable role. So the decision makers on the left-hand side, they are the ones who get the final say. They are the ones who get the sign-off. They are the ones who are arguably the ones who are going to present this to the country, if you will. And there were 3 groups: K-12 science teachers, faculties of education and teacher educators, and science education specialists in the ministries of education. This is a group that has given that core set of responsibilities to 3 groups, and they argued that the real legitimate bridge between the ministries of education and the science teaching community is our faculties of education. The role of professional scientists was one that was rather surprising in terms of being a role that was somewhat on the margins and perhaps in a place that is out on the periphery. There's much more in the manuscript that gets into a discussion of many who would typically be seen to be in advisory roles and those who don't have a defined role. I know that I'll have many colleagues who will see K-12 students as having no role in the architecture of curriculum as being something that would create some real problematica. So there's plenty here to guide some interesting elements in the research. And if I can go back to this model here, which unfortunately seems to be without a name. I can assure you that in what I was looking at last night, there were actually particular names here. But nonetheless, when we look back at who should be designing the curriculum, I do have to indicate that there may be perhaps a little bit of instrumental and research design bias here. Because these 3 groups of individuals, if we look at them collectively in the study, they wrote more, they argued more, they presented a research base more than any of the other groups that were involved in the study. And in a very different manner. And the chief reason for, and in all studies like this there is some attrition, the chief reason why I had large numbers of science teachers leave the study, I lost 2/3 of the teacher cohort over the course of the study. The most significant reason that was cited, and this was important in the Delphi, the most significant reason that they were citing as leaving the study is that they were overwhelmed by what they saw as the quality of responses provided by their colleagues who were not teachers, and they felt as though they had nothing further to contribute to the study. So it wasn't about time, it wasn't about their busy lives. More often than not, it was about, I cannot make any further contribution. There's a whole qualitative component that can come out of this that would be worth pursuing. To close, I have 2 key recommendations of the 6 that I have made in the wake of this study. And I think there's an important consideration that might need to be made here as we go forward. And maybe as we go forward here in the province of Manitoba, we are the most mature curriculum, arguably across the whole spectrum of curriculum in Manitoba, given the fact that we began reorganization in 1999-2000. So by virtue of being 15 years and very deep into a curriculum cycle, we actually may have a particularly unique opportunity here. I'm prepared to make the argument that this expert panel's work has provided a kind of inescapable direction that needs to be explored. And that's what's known as the sustainability sciences. And to put some definition on what's meant by that, it's a science education that understands the value of both Vision 1 and Vision 2, and maybe even a need for a Vision 3, which I'll get to momentarily. It's an orientation towards planetary systems. It would be a recognition that a science education of the future is one that's going to help us understand what it means to live in the Anthropocene period. a geological period where humanity is now perhaps the most significant geological and geochemical force. And it's also potentially a science education that will allow us to understand that marvelous planetary boundaries work that is coming out of the Center for Resilience in Sweden. And I invite you to take a look at the work that's being done there. And secondly, traditionally there has been monikers that are attached to the foundations of science curriculum. And we now seem to be coming out of that vision one of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, coming out of the blending that the science, technology, society, and environment focus of the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s has given us. We may need a new set of foci that now brings in the notion of the sustainability sciences, the recognition that we are a technology-rich set of societies, and that we fundamentally are embedded in critical Earth systems upon which all of our systems depend, including the economic. So the model that I am suggesting is that we begin to move to what could be described in two-dimensional space as a ternary model, and maybe in three-dimensional space as a tetrahedral model of science education, where alongside the vision one of seeing the world the way science does, alongside the vision two of seeing the world the way we may want to as an active democratic citizen, but a vision three that brings in a multitude of perspectives that come from indigenous systems of knowing and non-Western paradigms. And with those three potential visions in terms of curriculum architecture, there seems to be a very, very strong argument from this study to embed science education in this country firmly in a sustainability focus. And that, I think, presents an exciting and potentially very rewarding set of research agendas for us here in Canada. Thank you.
Dr. Tutton, first I would like to thank you for your presentation, and this is from Mern on behalf of that.
Thank you.
I'd also like to outdressed. Congratulate you on your completing your doctorate as well. It was wonderful. It was an excellent presentation. I'd like to remind everybody here, as well as those on the web, our guests, that in about 2 weeks' time, this presentation will be available on the web for viewing at your leisure. Thank you all very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Do we have a couple of minutes if there might be any questions?
Absolutely. By all means, open the floor.
Because there may be a couple of questions. And I'm going to be daring, and I'm going to leave you all with a manuscript in case you wanted to look at some of the details of this beyond what's presentable in.
Doctor, is that something that could be made available in a digital format so we could accompany it along with your video?
It's absolutely already available.
Oh, excellent.
This is a manuscript that's been accepted for publication. It will be coming out later on in 2015 in Research in Science Education out of Australia. It's a special issue that's looking specifically at what's being described as futures, plural, in science education globally. And so I think it's a very, very exciting time for us, and it's particularly interesting in the Manitoba milieu, where I've sensed that in the last 5 or 6 years, science education appears to be on the wane, and it's losing some of its apparent visible vitality in the midst of the great polarities of literacy and numeracy that are becoming our preoccupation. I'm counting certain blessings in that, because it sometimes means that we might be on the cusp of something really quite remarkable, and really looking at an opportunity that a study like this presents for the province of Manitoba, for example, going forward.